China built its very first highway in the year 1993. 18 years later, it had built one America's worth of highways. 9 years after that, it's built another America's worth of highways. Province of Guizhou has 45 of the world's tallest bridges. It has about 15 airports. It has high-speed rail, which the Americans do not. So America's richest states of California and New York do not feel like they are better built than China's fourth poorest province. I think that is a pretty striking contrast.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Dan Wang. Dan is a Canadian-Chinese writer and economist known for his annual China letters and essays on industrial policy and technology. A former Gavakal Dragonomics analyst, he spent years inside China in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Shanghai, as well as exploring some of its backwaters, now connected with magnificent bridges, highways, and high-speed rail. Today we're here to talk about his new book, Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. Dan, welcome to Decouple.
Great to be here, Chris.
First off, fantastic book. I've actually read it twice.
Wow. You've read it more than I have.
Maybe. Great analysis, very well referenced, but also like some interesting personal narrative arcs, exploring your time living in China, your family's experience leaving China. So again, very, very readable. Highly recommend the audience pick up a copy or two. It's Christmas time coming up. Dan, the other thing I've been impressed by, I've listened to a few of your appearances, I think, on Odd Lots. You've been around the podcast circuit, and I think there's a temptation with authors to have sort of canned responses once they've done enough of these podcasts. I was certainly eager to get in the queue kind of early on, but each of your interviews are really interesting and unique. Certainly not sort of, again, canned answers. So looking forward to a great discussion today.
Great, me too.
Okay, so I had Kyle Chan on not too long ago, and we kind of had this archetypal framing of involution capitalism versus stock buyback capitalism. Archetypes, I think, are really useful to sort of demystify. And I think in your case, you've really not oversimplified in this framing that you've come up with for China as the engineering state and the U.S. as the lawyerly society. So just to start off, if you could introduce that archetype to the listeners, and then I'm interested in exploring how they came to be, because I think we've seen some interesting movement in terms of how these societies have developed.
China is a country I call the engineering state because at various points, the entirety of the senior leadership was made up of engineers of a very Soviet sort. And China, I think, over the last few decades has been really distinguished by these vast spasms of construction. So they build roads and bridges and high-speed rail, solar, coal, wind, nuclear. I gather that you like nuclear while the Chinese are building it and the Americans are not. And they are just able to build everything throughout the physical environment. They also engineer the economy. One of the things I lived through when I was living in China was in the year 2021, Xi Jinping was overconfident and in a fit of hubris decided to try to have a controlled demolition of the real estate sector, as well as smack around a lot of tech founders. And I think both of these were mistakes. They are also engineers of the human soul. So I spend a lot of time writing about social engineering, especially about the one-child policy, as well as zero COVID, in which the number is right there in the name. There's no ambiguity about what these sort of things could possibly mean. I contrast the engineering state with the lawyerly society because America's full of lawyers. In the past, 13 of America's first 16 presidents were lawyers. Everyone from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln, 13 of them were lawyers. In the modern day, 48 members of the U.S. Senate went to law school. One had any STEM education. And so this is kind of one of these really striking contrasts. If we just take a look at the elites, I think the issue with lawyers is that they block everything, good and bad. So you don't have stupid ideas like the one-child policy. You also don't have functional infrastructure, I would say, almost anywhere in the U.S. And I dare say almost nowhere in Canada either, right? The GTA is just not really connected through functioning highways. I hear the traffic's pretty bad in Toronto.
I think we are top 3, if not top 2, for worst traffic in North America. We're up there with Los Angeles, and if we go into South America, Bogota. But yeah, no, it is horrendous. We have a light rail system that's been under construction for 12 years. We are actually building a nuclear plant right now, so I'll let you know how that goes. The West's first grid scale SMR. But certainly that's kind of spiked my interest in looking at China, and maybe fetishizing some of its ability to pull off mega projects, and nuclear probably being one of the hardest mega projects out there. As I mentioned, in your book, you explore that China hasn't always been the engineering society. This was a country under the iron fist of Mao, who was a man of letters, a poet, some would say a military genius of people's war. And similarly, the U.S. wasn't always a lawyerly society. You talk about Eisenhower, the construction of the highway network, Robert Moses, transformation of New York. So let's talk a little bit about how these things came to be. Let's start off with China.
Mao was a man of letters. He wasn't a rule by engineer. Rather, this was a rule by poet. And, that might sound nice, but it's pretty disastrous. Mao was responsible for the giant famine, the insanity of the Cultural Revolution. And sometimes I think that you don't want leaders who are really good at reading poetry and novels. Stalin and the rest of his Politburo was made up of a bunch of very talented literary critics. And, we know where that ended up. So sometimes it's better to be ruled by people who are a little bit more literal minded. But it was after Mao's misrule that Deng Xiaoping, when he took over as leader in the late 70s, decided that, what is the opposite of a poet? Well, certainly it is an engineer. And so he decided to promote a lot of engineers into the Politburo, whether these are hydraulic engineers, electrical engineers, civil engineers, etc. And that was what produced a lot of China's gigantic building spree, as well as engineers of the soul.
I guess we had sort of Lysenkoism under Mao. They were able to build the atomic bomb under
That's
Mao.
true.
And that always fascinates me that, a country with a very rural agricultural economy was still able to sort of, mobilize extraordinary resources and probably starve a bunch of its population in pursuit of, again, one of the ultimate engineering projects. Let's talk a bit about the U.S., though. There's been this transformation. I think you sort of say 1970s, the influence of Rachel Carson, Jane Jacobs, Ralph Nader, I guess. Ralph Nader. How does the U.S. transform from more of an engineering society into this lawyerly society?
So I think that the U.S. was a proto-engineering state for much of America's past, even though its elites were all lawyers. The elites were united in realizing that actually America is made up of this vast territory with very few people, and immigrants were streaming through, mostly through Europe. And so there was a consensus to knit the country together with infrastructure. And I think in this roughly 100-year period between the middle of the 1850s to the middle of the 1950s, the U.S. built canal systems, it built rail systems, skyscrapers in Chicago and Manhattan. It built the atomic bomb, it built the space program and the highway system as well. And then throughout the 1960s, the lawyers took over for excellent reasons. That Rachel Carson revealed how much DDT and other pesticides the Department of Agriculture was spraying everywhere. That Ralph Nader turned people against big industries as well as the government. That Robert Caro revealed the problems and the crimes of Robert Moses. And I think this is when the lawyerly society really took shape, that the lawyers changed in character. They used to be creative deal makers. Even all of the lawyers that staffed FDR's New Deal cabinet, they were interested in getting stuff done. They were working on behalf of, let's say, railroad tycoons, raising bonds for railroads or using eminent domain to turf people out of their homes who are in the way of the railroads. And so that is quite real. And throughout the 1970s, 1960s and 70s, Ralph Nader was really interested in turning students at elite law schools into litigators as well as regulators. And so they became much more interested in constraining the power of the government. When folks at law school started saying, "Sue the bastards," they were referring mostly to the government. And it is pretty remarkable how the extent to which the law students were sounding quite a lot like Ronald Reagan in saying something like, "Government is the problem, not the solution." So here's an idea I want to toss at you, Chris, and to play with. One of the reasons that the U.S. became the lawyerly society is because of this pretty important book, Jane Jacobs, the Life and Death of American Cities, right? And after Jane Jacobs, New York City mostly stopped building infrastructure, and that also coincided with loss of power of Robert Moses. Here's the idea I want to toss at you. Did Jane Jacobs save New York City and ruin Toronto? Because Toronto hasn't built enough infrastructure after Jane Jacobs moved there.
Well, Toronto was supposed to have a major expressway down Spadina Street, which is one of our main sort of north-south arteries, and I'm not sure that I would have loved that. But I mean, certainly, yeah, we are a little bit infrastructure starved. And as you're mentioning, the traffic is absolutely horrendous in the city. But I would have to acquaint myself more with, I recognize the name and the title of her book, but I've never read her stuff. And I have a friend who's obsessed with Robert Moses, but that's about, the depth of my understanding of these two in terms of my urban planning expertise. Um, I guess like another thing that sort of coincides with the 1970s is this transition of the US into sort of some people call it like a post-material society, very much a kind of consumerist society. People's basic needs were met. Maybe enough infrastructure had been built for the time that wasn't necessarily a focus anymore. We certainly saw in terms of electric power demand, things started to plateau. Kind of Amory Lovins was proved right that, the utilities had just done this very simplistic linear modeling. Electricity demand would go up forever. So things started to sort of cap off. Certainly now we're seeing surging electricity demand, at least projected, if the AI hyperscalers are right, if there is significant reshoring. So do you think that sort of plays into that transition? And it certainly suggests that maybe now that we need to build again, we need to kind of, I guess have the pendulum swing back a little bit towards being an engineering state or society. But yeah, I guess I'm interested in that sort of post-material moment in the 1970s.
I think it is really important to solve the problems of the present moment rather than litigate the problems of the past. And I am really struck by the character of a lot of law students today who, if you want to build anything, still bring up the crimes and problems of Robert Moses. And I think, Robert Moses certainly did a lot of bad things. And he was going to create a mid-Manhattan expressway that would have been exactly the equivalent of the Spadina expressway. And he was stopped, and that was good. But Robert Moses also built some of these the cultural institutions that make New York gleam. I'm thinking about the reorganization of the south of Washington Square Park, which he essentially gave to New York University, NYU. Robert Moses built Lincoln Center, which is the home of the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera, as well as the New York City Ballet and the American Ballet. And these are institutions that draw visitors from all over the country and all over the world to see some of these performances. And so I think that, it's fine to recognize his problems, but America does not still need to keep tackling the problems of the 1960s. I think for the most part, most law students still view doing a social impact litigation as just the highest form of good, instead of recognizing that, a lot of people really need the government to do well to solve a lot of these big problems, namely housing, mass transit, clean energy deployment, as well as building up our manufacturing base, which has pretty substantially rusted over the last few years and over the last few decades. And so my challenge to the law students is to say, how about let's solve the problems today rather than litigate the problems of the 1960s again and again? Because I think the pendulum does need to swing back. And let's just think about, what do people need?
Well, let's pivot to China now. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the U.S. And Canada. But you were on the ground for I think 6 or 7 years.
Correct.
I hear people that visited China, probably a bit earlier than you, like 2008, and maybe they went back more recently, and they just can't believe the transformation before their eyes. So just as someone who's on the ground, I always love getting that perspective of immersing through someone else's experience, living vicariously through you. How quick are things changing? What does it feel like to be on the ground there in terms of, again, this blossoming of one building project after another?
part of why I wrote my book is because I realized that most Canadians and most Americans will never visit China. And I think that that's just a fact, and that's fine. And I find it slightly more puzzling that many more Canadians as well as Americans are interested in visiting South Korea than they are China. But a lot of what I try to do is to give Americans a sense of the texture of what it's like to live in China's big cities. So I'm speaking to you today from San Francisco. I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, and I think any San Franciscan would understand that San Francisco is very different from Washington, D.C., which is very different from Dallas, Texas, which is very different from Boston, Massachusetts, etc. And I think people don't have necessarily a great appreciation of how different Chinese cities feel from each other. So Beijing feels, I think, like a concrete Stalinist, no fun zone. It is
Pyongyang-esque.
Yeah, it is. We call it Pyongyang of the West. And in Shanghai, we were referring to Shanghai as Paris of the East because Shanghai was very substantially built by the French. I lived in the French concession, full of these leafy boulevards, full of cafes, which felt totally wonderful. And Shanghai is still, I would say, my favorite city in China and maybe even in the whole of East Asia. That's really different from Shenzhen, which does feel like the Silicon Valley of China, namely these big office parks, as well as parking garages. It's not culturally all that interesting, and that's really different from Chongqing, which is a mega city in the southwest, which seems to emerge out of these cliff sides, full of these dramatic river views. It is a city that I call hydropunk. I'm a partisan for the Southwest. My family is from Yunnan, which is a neighboring province of Sichuan, and we believe that people in the Southwest really do drink a lot of tea, sit around telling jokes. We're probably the funniest region of China, I would submit. So, China has made up of these very diverse regions that is very well built out. China built its very first highway in the year 1993. 18 years later, it had built one America's worth of highways. 9 years after that, it's built another America's worth of highways. The province of Guizhou has 45 of the world's tallest bridges in the world. It has about 15 airports. It has high-speed rail, which the Americans do not. So America's richest states of California and New York do not feel like they are better built than China's fourth poorest province. I think that is a pretty striking contrast between the two of them. And China is much more interested in building nuclear, all sorts of nuclear. I don't really understand thorium. I don't really understand fusion. They seem to be experimenting a lot with it. Do you think that Chinese nuclear, how's the Chinese nuclear industry? Tell me a little bit about that.
It's not quite at the pace of the French when they were responding to the OPEC oil crisis on a per capita basis, but I've had China described to me by my friend Francois Morin, who's the China lead of the World Nuclear Association, as sort of, don't think of it as one country, think of it as like 28 Germany size countries in terms of the provinces. And there's certain provinces which, if you looked at the GDP per province, it would be absolutely bonkers. I believe in the southeast, because the coal is more in the northwest, and 50% of Chinese rail used to be tied up in just shipping coal around the country. So also probably for air pollution reasons. But yeah, the Chinese nuclear industry is booming. They're probably slightly behind the Russians, well, certainly in the export market, but in terms of domestic construction, they've done the kind of the buffet lunch sampling of the world's technologies, and I think have indigenized and are standardizing, and I think in a breakout moment. Although again, my friend Francois tells me the relative contribution is still something like 5 or 6% to the grid, and will be enough to satisfy China's 5G needs, not to decarbonize the country or save the world in that sense. But again, highly regionalized. But anyway, that's enough for me in terms of Chinese nuclear. But it is, I think that's, again, one of the reasons that I was drawn to your book, was just trying to understand, again, why we can't build nuclear plants in the West. It's basically impossible. And despite the stock market bubble right now, and vaporware companies with $25 billion market caps, I think a lot of that's unlikely to see fruition unless we see some sort of change in how we run our societies. So you mentioned, again, you kind of went in passing over some of these cities. I think people are familiar with, again, these kind of skyscrapers of Shenzhen, like Foxconn mega factories. There's all these stories of Western executives visiting. I'm not sure if they went to like the BYD mega factory in campus. But just like the scope and scale of these facilities is, I think, hard for people to get their minds around. But also, you talk about this bike trip you went on. Again, maybe it was in the Southwest, a very poor region. And it just seems like this infrastructure build out is diffuse and in places you just wouldn't expect, such as a very poor province with, as you're mentioning, world's highest bridges, et cetera. It's pretty astounding.
Yeah, Guizhou is exactly where I went. We spent 5 days. I scared up two friends to cycle with me for 5 days to go from the capital city of Guiyang to the hydropunk city of Chongqing. And yeah, it is. China's fourth poorest province has so much great levels of infrastructure. And I think this is just characteristic of the Leninist system of the engineering state. China is not very interested in redistribution. It doesn't have single-payer healthcare, which is so famous in Canada. Rather, they decide that what the people need is not transfer payments or welfare or single-payer healthcare. Rather, they just want taller and taller bridges and better high-speed rail. And I think part of the Chinese population wants something like that. But I think that the Chinese also deserve the provision of better services because oftentimes you have sometimes these public toilets which are not very well maintained. Often toilets don't give you toilet paper. They don't provide that as a public good. And so, I would rather see, some softer elements of China get better rather than continuously, more monumentalist infrastructure.
Okay, this is fascinating to me because China is clearly prioritizing an export market, eliminating the dependencies that it has had, creating dependencies for other countries now as it marches forward with China in 2025. Rather than cultivating sort of an internal market and sort of raising the wealth of its citizens more evenly as one would expect from a communist or a society that's socialist with Chinese characteristics. I'm giving you way too much to bite on here, and we'll dissect this bit by bit. But one of my favorite lines of your book is the greatest trick that the Chinese Communist Party ever pulled was convincing the world that it was a leftist regime. Can you expand on that? You did a little bit in terms of, I believe, just how anemic their social sector is, their welfare state is. But expand on that a little bit because I think that's a really important framing.
Yeah. Well, what do you expect out of socialism? Some degree of redistribution from the rich to the poor. And China doesn't do very much of that. According to the OECD numbers that I scrounged up, about 30% of Europe's GDP is committed to transfer payments. It's about 20% for the US, and it's about 10% for China. And so China simply doesn't pay very much. Its welfare system is pretty threadbare. A lot of people are unable to have unemployment insurance when they lose a job. And I think that the Chinese the taxation system is actually pretty regressive. It falls more on the poor because there's not much of a property tax. The Chinese haven't been able to roll out a broad property tax. And so that means that, for the rich, most of their wealth is tied up in property. Their property is more or less untaxed. And for a lot of the Chinese taxation system is funded by consumption taxes, which fall more on the poor. And if I take a look at the Chinese, economic system today, they really prize manufacturing. They keep a lot of immigrants out. And that sounds to me like Eisenhower's Republican 1950s America. Sometimes Xi Jinping makes these speeches to say that we should not be too generous with welfare provision. Otherwise, people will get lazy. This is when he sounds like Ronald Reagan, frankly.
Right. Welfare moms.
Yeah, so they are keeping out immigrants. They're enforcing traditional gender norms. There is some element in which China is socialist. So the state has control over a lot of the upstream sectors of the Chinese economy. So these are things like telecoms, aviation, energy. All of these are organized under mostly state control of the top sectors. There is some level of redistribution from richer provinces into the poor, mostly through the form of building public works. But for the most part, China does not seem very socialist or Marxist to me.
And there's interesting implications to not having that social security net. I guess in terms of that 30% of GDP in Europe going towards social services, a lot of that is maternity, a lot of that is elder care. We've got a pending sort of demographic bomb in China due to the one-child policy, which we'll get into a little bit later. But people are savers, not spenders, and maybe that's part of why like an internal market has not developed and a richer consumer society has not developed. But it also seems that that's part of the playbook, because what fascinates me about the Chinese system is the control over, I guess, capital allocation. Where capital is, who makes the decisions about how capital is spent. And I guess if capital were more diffusely distributed amongst the population because of a greater welfare state and redistribution, you might not be able to have that same sort of level of control to plan the economy as the engineering leadership sees fit.
So much of the engineering state is about maximizing the discretion of the government leadership and minimizing the discretion of the individual. And they assert the right to interpret the public interest as they wish. I think sometimes they get it right, but not always.
So let's talk about what I would probably characterize. Maybe you could talk about the Maoist famines, but we're talking about the engineering state now. So one of the sort of most egregious attacks on individual rights that the West, the lawyerly society, is far better at protecting, particularly for rich people. But the one-child policy as an artifact of the engineering state. Lay it on us. When I was reading your book and some of the details, absolutely shocking. And really sort of China's the only country that was able to achieve what sort of Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb folks laid out. And I believe received some praise from Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich had a tweet in 2015 when the one-child policy ended, condemning the end of this policy. So really interesting interplays between the West and the East. I'm fascinated. Tell us kind of the origins of it, how it came about, who led it. This will probably be multi-questions because it's such an interesting moment that I think so important, especially for folks like myself who occasionally fetishize the engineering state and its ability to pull off mega projects. What's the dark underbelly or the darkest underbelly?
The dark underbelly of the engineering state is that I think for the most part, physical construction is good for people. People like seeing their cities change. It gives them a sense of optimism for the future once they've observed change in the past. Physical dynamism produces all sorts of problems, but I think on net, it is pretty good for a society to be able to do that. The problem with China is that China is not just made up of a lot of physical engineers. They're also made up of social engineers. And I think social engineering is almost entirely bad. So I had no idea that Paul Ehrlich celebrated or condemned the end of the one-child policy. I think that Paul Ehrlich has been one of the greatest agents of the West in trying to cripple the East. That's pretty remarkable. So how did the one-child policy develop? It developed in part because China was facing what it judged to be a major population crisis after the end of Mao's reign. After Deng Xiaoping took office, I think the Chinese leadership realized that China's population was really large, but they had no idea how large. And once they realized that China had over 1 billion people, first country in the world to have over 1 billion people, they were very glum as well as alarmed at how many mouths that they had to feed. They were worried that the overpopulation was going to defeat China's economic prospects. So along comes this missile engineer whose name was Song Jian. And Song was a brilliant mathematician. He was one of China's leading experts of cybernetics. He went to the West, picked up these stupid ideas by Paul Ehrlich, written in The Population Bomb. And he thought that China, as the world's most world's most populous nation, would have a population bomb of its own. And so he grew excited about these population projections that the world was on track for something in between the gradual decline of global living standards to the total extinction of human existence. And he thought that China needed a more radical agenda. And he whispered into the ears of China's leadership, who were very ready to listen to him, that what China needed at the time was something like the one-child policy, which was extraordinarily elegant in defeating diffusing the population bomb. And I think that the first point about the engineering state is that only a missile engineer, only in China could a missile engineer really get into population planning. Can you imagine this happening anywhere else in the West? And it's only because the Chinese leadership really prized the wisdom of the mathematicians as well as the natural scientists. They thought that the natural scientists they had the answers to absolutely everything, that they were inclined to let a missile scientist get anywhere near the design of population policy. I think my second point is that the one-child policy could be conducted only in the engineering state, because what did the one-child policy actually entail? Well, throughout the 1980s, which is when the one-child policy enforcement peaked, I think I describe it as a campaign of rural terror meted out against overwhelmingly female bodies, against people who were not really able to tell their stories to much of the outside world. And according to China's official statistics, over the course of the 35 years of the one-child policy, China had conducted over 300 million abortions, and it had sterilized around 100 million women as well as 25 million men.
But when we talk about this number of abortions, this is not women choosing to exercise their fertility or family planning rights. These are forced abortions. I mean, that kind of sort of goes without saying, but
Well, these were abortions writ large, and it's hard to separate out what is the correct number of abortions. I mean, there's a natural number of abortions every year, and it is really difficult to tell how many of these are coerced, mostly because the Chinese realized that coercion looks bad, and so they will really try to I put in air quotes, persuade women to have an abortion. Then they will.
So how did they persuade them, quote unquote?
They will send troops of government officials into. They have what they are formally called persuasion groups of officials who go up to women, and in some cases, in some reported cases, there might be up to 100 visits by officials to tell a woman, you really need to have an abortion in the name of the national interest. And very rarely can any family sustain visit of a rotating cast of 100 of up to 100 visits by officials who grow steadily more quote unquote persuasive in their methods to try to harangue women to agree to sterilization or an abortion.
You mentioned like removing the roof from a household, even like.
Yeah, so that is part of some of these methods that the engineering state had. In the countryside, they would take away your livestock. So, if you had a pig or a cow, which is kind of one of your main methods that you count on for longer term survival, they would take that away. They might knock down one of your walls or rip off your roof if you refuse. They would tell these families that if you have a child, that child will not be able to receive education, that child would not be able to have health care. You would have to pay these fines, which are sometimes light, sometimes ruinous, in order for you to lose a lot of your own benefits. And so these are some of these pretty coercive methods that the engineering state imposed. In the peak abortion years, I think, there's one year in which they conducted something like 17 million abortions, I believe, in the year of 1983. And just over the course of the 35 years, China conducted about the number of abortions as the population of the United States today. So, this is one of these legacies. And other legacies of the one-child policy include something like 40 million missing girls. So the one-child policy introduced a major son preference among Chinese. And so rural people really felt that they needed to have a son in order to work on the farms and perpetuate the family line. And a lot of families engaged in sex-selective abortions. So they had an abortion if it was a girl, and that produced a major surplus of men over women. What that also produced was a lot of international adoptions. So there's something like 130,000 Chinese girls who were sent to the United States to be adopted. And you have, a lot of one-child families. After I've written this book, some families have come up to me during book signings and stuff to say, yeah, we adopted a little baby girl from China, and for most part, they tell me that this is a great thing to happen to them. That their daughter, their Chinese daughter, was a really great thing to happen to them. What that also produced was, in some cases, state-sponsored abductions of children in China. Sometimes these were out-of-plan children, which meant that this was the second or third child that a family wasn't able to have. They would abduct a child, give it to an orphanage, and the orphanage could collect something like $5,000 from American families when they adopt. And that would be a total fortune for a lot of these families, because the Americans would come to China bearing crisp $100 American bills in order to give to these orphanages. And it created, a sense that the state was essentially selling children abroad, which the state kind of had to counteract this perception. But I think the one-child policy was certainly the greatest mistake of the post-reform and opening era. Perhaps the only other comparable mistake would be the mowing down of student protesters in Beijing in the year 1989. But this was one of the big mistakes of Deng Xiaoping, and this created so many radical problems that China is still having a hard time resolving today.
I'm just curious, again, visiting the origins of the policy. Song Jiang was, one of very few scientists, I believe, that, got to have the privilege to go to the West. I think he attended a conference in Helsinki where he first sort of became acquainted with these ideas. Mao famously was anti-Malthusian. He celebrated, more and more and more Chinese. I think it made him, I think in your book you say, made him really complacent about the risk of nuclear war, because, hey, if they wipe out a couple 100 million, we can just out reproduce them. We'll be back. So again, I'm just curious, in your research, was this purely sort of a Western intellectual contagion that made its way into China? In terms of, again, the origins of this preoccupation? It's got to be more than just Song Jiang, but he does sound like such a momentous figure. Again, Paul Ehrlich, as the kind of one of the intellectual authors, bears some responsibility, especially kind of bemoaning the end of the policy. And I believe, I couldn't find the quote, but I came across it at one point, basically saying, like, China, its political system, made it uniquely capable of essentially making his vision come true.
We shouldn't overstate the impact of Ehrlich or Song Jian, because their ideas were pushing on an open door. I think that Deng Xiaoping was ready for radical solutions to overpopulation. The second most powerful figure in China, Cheng Yun, was trying to centrally plan the economy. And the two of these people worked pretty closely together. And they were trying to get China out of the morass of the Mao years. And they tried to do a lot of central planning, and they realized that 1 billion mouths was too many to feed. Now, I think that, and into this environment waded in Song Jian, who was justifying the one-child policy through all of these fancy cybernetics, even though the policy recommendation feels so crude today. But I think the tragedy is that Deng Xiaoping did not actually absorb the lessons of Mao. I think Mao was correct in this case, that he said that he was anti-Malthusian because he said that the problem of overpopulation has been solved and the solution is production. And China had been poor not because it had overpopulation, but because it had a mess of an economy that couldn't feed its own people, that there was investment in heavy industry, there was investment in all sorts of state and national projects, but there wasn't enough for the consumer economy. The great irony of the one-child policy was that it was taking place under the backdrop of Deng Xiaoping's efforts to loosen the economy. And as he loosened the constraints on the economy, he was just really producing. China was able to produce a lot more goods and a lot more food because Deng Xiaoping was giving up on central planning of any sort. And I think my view is that the one-child policy was a mistake from the start, that if Deng Xiaoping had just loosened a lot of these controls China's fertility rate was already in decline, that a lot of families, especially in urban areas, were not having many children, that education is the best contraceptive method of all. And as China grew more rich and was able to educate more people, this fertility rate would have declined without some of these horrific atrocities that the state visited upon the countryside.
So the one-child policy was reversed in 2015. I believe now there's a two-child policy or even a three-child
Three child
policy.
now, yes.
And as part of this, the greatest trick the Chinese Communist Party ever pulled. One other thing we didn't mention in terms of being a very right-wing country, as most would define it objectively when given the facts, is very stereotypical gender roles, which I imagine are reemerging if you're saying, hey, we need women to really reproduce at this point. So why did the one-child policy hang on for so long? And just talk about that whiplash towards two and now a three-child policy. Is there any success there? Can they socially engineer people to have lots of kids?
Yeah, well, it turns out that you can have this campaign of forced abortions throughout the countryside if you just hire enough thugs. But try coercing young people to procreate. I think that is much more difficult. I think it's hard to coerce people into copulation. So that is rather challenging. Pro-fertility policies have not worked broadly around the world. It seemed like maybe Hungary was able to do it after spending quite a lot of its GDP on birth subsidies, but essentially that does not seem to have worked over the longer term. It simply pulled forward some of these births that were already going to happen. I think the one-child policy hung on for so long in part because it created an entrenched interest group, namely the Family Planning Commission, that employed something like 200,000 full-time staff, as well as millions of mostly thugs in order to enforce the policy. According to official media, the policy had collected hundreds of billions of dollars in fines over the lifetime. And so there were a lot of people whose livelihood depended on giving abortions to women. And so I think that is just one of these very perverse issues with the engineering state that, once you create targets, people really try to maximize these targets. And you have these administrative bodies that really try to hang on to these sort of things. And this administrative body kept trying to tell the leadership, no, we cannot get rid of the one-child policy. There's so much underreporting. People are hiding children from us. And we really cannot let this go. And so a lot of these enforcers have actually now turned, had a 180-degree turn from enforcing birth controls into trying to encourage copulation again. And there's a lot of neighborhood committees, which is kind of the lowest level of Chinese officialdom. They are party committees. You have a lot of women trying to go up to residents in cities to say to new wives, new mothers to ask them, when was your last period? Tell me about your menstrual cycle. And don't you know that cats and dogs are no replacement for actual babies? And I really like this quote that surfaced in the media of a woman who recently married who said that her parents had only asked her once whether she plans to have kids, whereas these neighborhood officials have already asked her 6 times when she's going to have kids. And so, this is kind of one of these problems of the engineering state, that it is sometimes a little bit too organized. After living for 6 years in China, I realized that governments could be too efficient, and it could be a problem if there's too much state capacity. And I would just rather that, there maybe sometimes it's better to have a little bit less.
So we're talking about, the control of women's bodies, arguably, particularly kind of peasant women, some of the least powerful within Chinese society. What I'm fascinated with is the Chinese state's ability to control who I would sort of describe, or discipline who I would describe as the untouchables. So the finance sector, I understand there's salary caps now, blocking what would be the world's largest IPO of Ant, I guess the Alipay people. And in general, just able to, in a way that I think is impossible in the US with lobbyists, with campaign finance, et cetera. I'm sure there's corruption in China, but I'm just really impressed at the ability of the Communist Party to be able to enforce and again, I guess just maintain control over capital. So explain again, moving from the control over vulnerable young women's bodies to the control over tech giants and finance giants. How on earth is the Chinese state capable of that?
Yeah, I think that is a very perceptive point. But first, I will object to your use of the word peasant woman. I exclusively call it rural folks in my book. And the one time I used the word peasant was to quote the Communist Party as using the word peasant to describe its own population. I think you're absolutely right that the elites in China feel kind of precarious. I think this is one of these really striking things about authoritarian systems where the elites feel very precarious and they don't have a lot of protection. You're right that China introduced a salary cap last year of folks working in finance. There's a salary cap of $300,000. And if you make more than that in past years, you may have to give up some of your back pay if you are over that sort of threshold. And if you are working for a tech company in China, you never know when Xi Jinping is going to smack around your founder or delay your IPO, because that is quite a big thing that Xi Jinping has been pretty interested in. Imagine if you're a party elite or part of the state or military elite. If one of your patrons goes down, his entire network falls. And because Xi has been escalating his anti-corruption probes, just today, we're recording in mid-October, there's a story that Xi has purged the second highest ranking officer of the People's Liberation Army. This is a sitting member of the Politburo, highly unusual to purge high-level military officials of that level. And so, this is just something that people feel pretty precarious about in Beijing. And I think that is one of these big differences with the West, which is that I think the US, for better or for worse, is the greatest country ever to be part of the super rich. If you're a part of the super rich in America, you can more or less transmute your wealth into some degree of political influence. And I think the rich in California, as well as New York, don't really have to deal with a lot of the problems. You don't have to deal with high housing costs because you own, a nice little unit in one of these skinny skyscrapers that overlook Central Park in New York City. You don't really take the subway to work because you have your own private drivers or whatever else. And so this is just one of these quite odd things about America. I think that is a strength as well as a weakness. The West Coast of America is the only region that has created several companies worth over trillions of dollars. NVIDIA is over $4 trillion. Apple is worth over $3 trillion. That is pretty remarkable, but I think America can't stay a great power for long if it works only well for the rich.
I guess I'm curious about Marxist-Leninism as the kind of OS, or the operating system of the Chinese state. What exactly, you've described China as a Leninist technocracy. People are looking for terms. Is it state capitalism at this? What is Leninist technocracy? How does it work?
I call China a Leninist technocracy with grand opera characteristics. First of all, it is Leninist because it is ruled by a cadre of revolutionaries who feel like their main task is to raise the Chinese people into modernity by hook or by crook. It is technocratic because China does really well in terms of organizing things like train stations and subway stations and bridges. You can't build a bridge unless it's pretty technocratic. And in a lot of ways, Chinese urban designs sometimes look pretty technocratic and well-functioning. The problem is that they also have these grand opera characteristics. I'm a big opera fan, and every so often it really feels like the Chinese, with their pageantry, are reenacting a Wagnerian opera in which the gods are ready to ascend into Valhalla. And so this is just one of these very strange things in China where things seem pretty well-ordered and governed and technocratic until something completely collapses into something as ridiculous as zero COVID, in which they have no sense of what they're actually doing to the people, how mad people are, and they're ready to continue doing this because they feel like they're on the road to Valhalla, and that is quite okay for them to continue to pursue.
Okay, just because we've got a few minutes, I wanted to pivot to this question around China 2025. This kind of crisis of overproduction, which is also, I guess, a strategy of overproduction in terms of creating, production at scale with which the West just absolutely can't compete. So I guess we've talked a little bit about involution capitalism in previous episodes and sort of, I guess, some of the internal domestic damage from that. But as sort of grand strategy in terms of, Chinese geopolitical strategy, this question of scale and of overproduction, again, rather than trying to elevate an internal market for its goods, China and its leadership are very much focused in terms of elevating China's state power by playing this game of staying pretty export focused. Could you comment on that a little bit?
China makes a little bit too much of everything. So global auto demand is something like 90 million cars every year. And China has the capacity to make 60 million cars. That's just 2/3 of global demand in one country alone. China has kind of a monopoly of all sorts of technologies, including now rare earth magnets, and also certain types of antibiotics, certain types of fever reducers. Certain types of electronics. China is the only country that makes these sort of things. And I think that China is just so focused on production because it is the engineering state. Doesn't think enough about demand. Doesn't think about whether it should be making some of these products. It's just focused on making these products better and better. And that is creating some trade frictions around the world, but it is also creating some of these very nice technological successes that Chinese are proud of. China is making much better electric vehicles than the Americans, the Japanese, and the Germans, and they're cheaper to boot. China is making some of the most efficient solar photovoltaics and all sorts of other goods, and that is kind of just one of these big advantages of China. So China is, I think, not going to replace the U.S. as the global superpower in all of its dimensions. The U.S. is also a financial superpower, a diplomatic superpower, a cultural superpower, and the engineering state is not great at finance or cultural production, but it is really good at advanced manufacturing. And if China wins on advanced manufacturing alone, then it might still have a pretty good chance at really hurting the West. Right now, the U.S. has about 12 million manufacturing workers. Could I see that going down? Yeah, I could see that going down to, let's say, a few million shorter by the next decade. And as the West's economic situation deteriorates because of some degree of job loss in manufacturing, I think its politics will not get better. And so I'm quite worried about the U.S. and most of Europe because they are going to be outproduced by China.
Okay, Dan, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for coming on Decouple. I hope to have you back for a part 2 once your media schedule cools off a little bit. This was a real pleasure, man. Really fun conversation.
Very happy to have a part 2. Maybe we can record in person in Toronto. I really miss the city, and so let's get some great food on Spadina or Dundas, and and then record a podcast. Maybe more focused on Canada.
I love it. All right, Dan, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.